Most people think, oh, the problem is we have such differences in our country. Our view is that's not a problem. We've always had differences, and we always will have differences because we're 300 million plus human beings who are different. We're going to have differences. Difference is not the problem. Contempt is the problem. When you look at the burnout ratios for teachers, which have gotten increasingly worse almost every year, the last 10 or 15 years, the percentage of teachers we're losing within 5 years of starting their careers because of what? Feeling isolated, overwhelmed, under attack, underprepared, all those things. Almost none of them have to do with whether the teacher didn't feel like they knew how to teach biology. It's all relationship issues. It's all social issues. It's all threat and contempt issues. How do you diffuse contempt in the culture of a school? We actually have some really good solutions around that. When I look to the institutions of this nation and I look to who and where are there people who know that everybody deserves a chance, where are the people who know that hope and development are the actual work of community building, of nation building, where are the people who trust that new ideas can emerge? It's schools.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and my guest today is someone many of you have probably heard of. He's a member of the Shriver family and therefore the Kennedy family. The family tree is fascinating, but let me just say that one of his uncles is John F. Kennedy, another is Robert F. Kennedy, one of his cousins is Robert Kennedy Jr., who was recently nominated by President-elect Trump to head up the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm honored to introduce my guest, Tim Shriver. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Tim, you've served as chairman of the Special Olympics since 1996, but most recently you co-founded an organization called Unite, an initiative designed to promote unity among Americans, and something called the Dignity Index. And finally, and I'm sure I've left some things out, but you also spent many years as a classroom teacher. I wonder if you could just say a bit about what it was like being a classroom teacher and what lessons you took away from that experience.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Ken. I started my career as a teacher in 1981 in the New Haven public schools and the Upward Bound program at the University of Connecticut, where I worked for several years, and then trained with Jim Comer at the Yale Child Study Center in child development and school reform, and tried to figure out how we could be better as educators at looking at the issues around risk and resilience and the social connection children feel to schools. And so that led to the creation of the field of social and emotional learning. It was built by a kind of a collaboration of several of us in the early and then into the mid 80s. So my first career, my training, my professional shaping came as a teacher and then as a curriculum supervisor in a small urban district in the United States. So that's where I kind of cut my teeth as an adult, and then moved from there into the Special Olympics movement. But when you asked me about teaching and being a teacher, I'd say, first of all, some of the most powerful, if not the most powerful professional relationships of my life were shaped by the mentors I found there, people like Bob Brown and Red Verderame and Ben Hunter. These were all principals, assistant principals, guidance folks, leaders in and around the school systems, and the kids who really taught me, some of these expressions you hear as a teacher. It's not how much you know, it's how much you care. I didn't understand that until the kids taught me. I didn't understand how powerful it was to know a child and to have a child feel seen in order to have a child feel motivated to learn. I thought, rigor and excellence and hard work and determination were the critical things, and mastering content. And I was, determined to help my students do all those things. And those things weren't wrong, but they were missing an element of relational trust. They were missing overcoming the fear that many kids face in their communities, the anger, the hostility, the sort of I'd say almost well-deserved cynicism that many kids have about the future. Do they fit? Does anybody care? Does the country care? Does the city care? Do people care about them? Kids don't take that for granted. And I learned that, when we can unlock the trust and the strength of a relationship, then we can do almost anything when it comes to learning academic material. But if we don't focus on strengthening if we don't have strong relationships, we can't teach anything. The brain won't let us. We know this now from neuroscience. So I learned a huge amount at the seat of the 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds who taught me when I was a teacher, and the mentors who believed in me when honestly there wasn't a lot to believe in. I wasn't very, anybody who's listening to this can remember their first year teaching, second year. Most of us who remember that think, my goodness, I got everything wrong. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do. I made so many mistakes. And, when I was in that situation, feeling that way, there were teachers who were like, no, you got this, you can do this. And made me laugh and made me, listen, and made me keep coming to school a little earlier and staying a little later and trying a little harder, and, unlocked a huge amount of hope and possibility in my life. And I'll always be grateful for those years.
Yeah. I have another podcast called Teacher Stories, and it really created it about 5 or 6 years ago to hear stories like the ones you were telling there, to find out what is it. We sometimes forget that the teachers have an incredibly profound impact on our lives and our communities, and we sometimes forget to go back and thank them. And I just wanted to collect stories from people about teachers that have made a difference. But I once interviewed a guy who's a writer, has been writing about education for years, Alfie Kohn, he lives up in Cambridge in Massachusetts, and he's written a lot about teaching. I said, Alfie, what is it that you think are sort of common elements of great teaching? And I said, what I found, Alfie, is almost every student I've spoken to who talks about a teacher that made a difference is how much they cared about them. And he said something that I thought was quite important, and it's relevant to what you and I are going to talk about today. He said, not only do great teachers care about their students, they care unconditionally. And I'm thinking about a person I interviewed a few weeks ago for this podcast, Aaron Stark. Aaron Stark was almost a school shooter. And it was a friend of his who, during a very, very turbulent time when he had figured out a way to get a gun that could kill a lot of people, and he was almost going to commit this heinous act. And his friend, who didn't give up on him, said, you are a good person with a crap life. And he just broke down and cried and decided this one person who cared about him unconditionally was reason enough for him not to kill people. And he had a line that he shared with me. And he said, what we need to do is to convince people to give love to the ones that you think deserve it the least because they need it the most. And I think that some of the great teachers, or the stories I've heard from people who say they cared about me, they may have been the person that managed to save my life, are teachers that cared unconditionally. But one of the things I know you've also done is you've worked with an organization called Castle, maybe helped found it, and there's this sentiment out there, maybe you can talk about it, that social emotional learning, leave that to parents. It doesn't belong in schools. You're prying into the lives, and yet, as you alluded to, the things are inextricably related, academic learning and one's social and emotional health. You can't separate those things out. So if you're really concerned about academic learning, which we all should be, you have to pay attention to these other factors.
Yeah. Well, it's a kind of a confusing misnomer to think that there's ever a situation in which we separate our social or our emotional or our cognitive lives from one or the other. A brain doesn't come to school without a heart. I mean, there's no brain in school. I've never seen a brain in school.
Huh.
And even the neuroscience about the brain suggests that it has a filter. People pay attention. Attention is a filter. It's like a muscle. You have so much of it and you deploy it. I can pay attention to what you're saying. I can pay attention to the books behind me. I can pay attention to sound, to color, to things that are in my past that are rumbling through my mind, things that are in my future that I'm worried about. I can pay attention to all that. So the capacity of the brain to pay attention is driven by social connection, physiologically. So my desire to learn the difference between a vowel and a consonant as a 6-year-old is driven by my connection to the teacher who wants me to learn. And I look up at the teacher and I think to myself, this teacher is important to me. I want to learn what she wants me to learn. Or I want to learn because I should learn, or I want to learn because my mom or my dad or my caregiver wants me to learn. It's all relational, right? So it's not a question of whether or not we should address the social and emotional dimensions of learning. It's just a question of how much time we spend on it, and whether we do it well or whether we do it poorly. And my view is like, if we can do it well, why wouldn't we do it well instead of doing it poorly?
Yeah.
There's not a exact science of what it looks like to do it well, but there are some indicators now as the field grows of things that work. It helps children to learn when they feel emotionally safe in a classroom. It helps children to learn when they feel like they can manage their own feelings, when they can self-regulate. It helps children to learn when they think other kids care about them and they care about other, when they have friends. These are all active contributors to academic achievement, to the brain being able to lock in on how to learn, on how to read or how to memorize the periodic table of the elements, or how to know the dates of the Civil War, whatever it is. So the question is, should we give that knowledge to teachers so that the teacher who's teaching the Civil War can also help children pay attention, feel connected, find their voice, exercise some degree of purpose, know that the Civil War in some way relates to their own meaning and purpose in life? All those things. Should we tell social studies teachers teaching the Civil War, here are the ways in which you can engage the social and emotional life of your students that have shown to work? Or should we say, oh, just do it yourself, figure it out on your own? So my view is like, it's not a question of whether we do social and emotional learning. It's just a question of whether we do it well. And if we do it poorly, we're still doing it. But we're just not doing it in a way that helps both teachers and students. And by the way, when you look at teacher stress, when you look at the burnout ratios for teachers, which have got increasingly worse almost every year, the last 10 or 15 years, the percentage of teachers we're losing within 5 years of starting their careers because of what? Feeling isolated, overwhelmed, under attack, underprepared. All those things, almost none of them have to do with whether the teacher didn't feel like they knew how to teach biology. It's all relationship issues. It's all social issues. It's all threat and contempt issues. How do you diffuse contempt in the culture of a school? We actually have some really good solutions around that from the social emotional learning work and the dignity index work. We ought to make it available to teachers and be responsible in how we do that. It's not a question of home or school. It's a question of home and school. It's really a question of kids and how they learn.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Dignity Index. It's something you co-founded. Talk a bit about what it is and why you helped create it and how it's being used in schools today.
Well, the Dignity Index is an 8-point scale that measures with some degree of objectivity, a lot of objectivity. It can measure how you treat another person when you disagree. So it doesn't measure the facts upon which you disagree. It doesn't measure whether, let's say, you think that Roosevelt should have won the election of 1928, or whether someone else should have, or excuse me, of 1932. I'm getting my dates mixed up. Or whether you think, Richard Nixon should have been the president in 1960 instead of John F. Kennedy. It doesn't measure that. It just measures, if you and I disagree, how we treat each other. And the continuum from 1 to 8 is, at 8, I treat you with dignity no matter what, no matter how different our principles. And at 1, I've given up on you to the point where I think you should die. violence is being required of me to manage or dispense of you. And at every level, from 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, we can show how I characterize you and where it fits on that scale, and whether I use 2 language or 4 language or 6 language or whatever. So we built this, Ken, because we felt like there's an issue in our culture, in our families, in our homes, and in our schools that we haven't paid that much attention to. And the issue is how we treat each other when we disagree. Most people think, oh, the problem is we have such differences in our country. Our view is that's not a problem. We've always had differences, and we always will have differences because we're 300 million plus human beings who are different. We're going to have differences. Difference is not the problem. Contempt is the problem. When we have differences, there's lots of ways. With you and a spouse or a child or a best friend, you will have differences, and you will resolve them either in a healthy way or in an unhealthy way. It's what you do all day long. So we wanted to say, look, gang, we don't have a difference issue. We don't have a political or an economic issue. We have a contempt issue. We have started to normalize contempt as the strategy by which we treat each other when we disagree. So the index shows us that pattern objectively. But what it also does, and what's most exciting about it as we've worked with it over the last 2 years, is that it mostly has what we call the mirror effect. And you'll see at the 2, I think those people are evil. They're going to ruin our country if we let them. It's us or them. And I think to myself, well, that's the way I talked about the other political party last night at dinner with my friends. I was saying, those people are evil. And so I say, okay, I scored a 2. And then what typically happens is people think to themselves, I don't want to be that kind of person. I could have said something like, I fully engage with the other side and I want to discuss values, even the values we don't share. And I want to be open to admitting mistakes. And I want to try to change other people's minds and my own too. That's a 7. I didn't change my opinion on whether or not to build a wall or whether or not how to manage immigration or how to manage funding for education. I stuck to my principle. I can stick to my principle, but still treat people like 7s. So what it has as an effect is it almost turns from a scale into a skill. And so on the back of our little card, we list skills like how to be curious and not furious. So how to show curiosity in a conversation is almost invariably a way of treating the other person with dignity. How to listen better, listen to hear, as we say, not to respond. Listening to someone, really trying to hear them instead of trying to respond to them, is another way of showing dignity to people. It doesn't change what you think of what they're saying. It just shows them some dignity. So we have the scale on the one side of this little toolkit. This is a 1-page toolkit. Teachers like this kind of stuff. Keep it simple, make it easy to use. One side, we have the scale, very easy to learn. Other side, we have the skills, easy to teach if you've got these access to these kinds of lessons. So schools, we didn't design this for schools. We designed this for politics, actually. But schools and businesses have been the places that have been very excited about it. So we have we have social studies teachers that are teaching U.S. history and getting kids to use the index to score speeches from U.S. history. So you read the speeches of Lincoln or William Jennings Bryan or Theodore Roosevelt or Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman or, Martin Luther King Jr. or Franklin Roosevelt, and you score them. You can take this out, and the students learn how to dissect the rhetoric in the political history, looking for whether this particular figure used dignity or contempt in the course. And then we have other elementary school teachers who are creating codes of conduct using this. So we have a school district in Utah, the Salt Lake City School District, that has created what they call the 5 and up rule. So from 5 to 8 on the index is what we'd call the dignity half. The contempt half is 4 down to 1. The dignity half is 5 up to 8. And so they've said to kids, when you disagree, we want you to use 5, 6, 7, or 8 language. And if you use 1 through 4 language, we want you to self-correct.
Mm.
So you can see some code of conduct work. You can see some discipline and discipline management adaptations of this. We've got school boards that are asking us, could you please come and train people that come to present at school boards on how to use dignity language when they're fired up and angry about something, not to attack and dehumanize and humiliate people on the other side of an issue. So we've got some traction there too. So there's a lot of really exciting ways in which this pretty simple framework and measurement tool can act as a pretty powerful teaching tool also, I think.
Yeah.
I hope.
I've got a load of questions that
Good,
I have,
good,
and I'm curious about as I'm coming in at the above the 4 level with my curiosity.
Thank you.
Well, here's one, and I suspect my listeners are probably a lot of questions too, but I'll try to imagine what those questions are. But let's say we have a student who comes in at level 4 on your index, which is, as I read it, mocks or attacks the side's background beliefs or commitment. So that's just below the middle point. But what if the mocking is just plain bullying and it has really nothing to do with another kid's position? It's just done to get attention from your peers, or it just feels good to feel better than someone else or to put someone down. I mean, that's certainly treating others without dignity. But I wonder, does the index or the strategies you have on the reverse side of the card address that kind of behavior, those undignified ways of acting?
Well, look, I mean, here's the thing. As one 8th grader said to me when I was visiting her school in Iowa, she said, I'd asked her a lot about bullying in her school. And she said, our school's pretty good. You keep asking me about bullying, but if you want to know where the bullies are, look at the adults.
Hmm.
She said, adults are the bullies. So she was saying to me, if you want to look at 4 and 3 and even 2 language, turn on the news. And you'll find United States senators, congressmen, governors, presidents of both parties who are using bullying language. So it's not just a 5th grader on the playground. It's all of us. And you're absolutely right. We do see. So the way in which the index can help in this situation, first of all, if kids learn the index, and they can learn it quite quickly. This is not something that's going to take 65 lessons of, classroom time. They can learn it in really half-hour intervals quickly over maybe the course of even a few days. They start to recognize it, and they start to be able to say, like, this happened to me when I was in a meeting the other day with a bunch of senior leaders at a university, and I said something, and the woman who was the dean of students said, Tim, you just used 3 language. I was like, you're right. I just used 3 language. Thank you for reminding me. Let me try to rephrase that. So people become familiar. They have a language to address the bully. And the bully also actually becomes, we hope, more self-aware. It doesn't mean it's going to change everything perfectly. But when that kid comes in and sits down with her teacher, his teacher, or the assistant principal, or whoever it is, the social worker who's going to now talk to that bully, we all of a sudden have a very simple way of calibrating. Hey, little Tim, you went around telling all those kids over there that you're better than them, that they don't belong at school, that you're going to kick them out. That's 4 language. Do you see that? And I said, yes, I do see that, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Smith. Is there a way you could have expressed yourself using 6 or 7 language? Well, I was so upset because they kept stealing the ball from the other kids. I said, well, you could have said, I don't think it's fair for you to steal the ball. Why don't we come and find a way to work out a solution, right? Okay, so the index invites a kind of an orientation towards change without, beating the child with his or her, mistakes. It doesn't release the child from accountability, or the adult from accountability. It actually makes accountability a healthy thing as opposed to a punitive only relationship. So these are ways in which we're starting to see the index work. I thought you were going to say, uh, you know, uh, does the index? I thought you were going to ask me, does it stop people from being able to say what they want? That's something we get. Well, is this going to constrain free speech? Are you telling me if I'm angry at Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or whoever it is, Putin or the governor, I'm furious at that person, and are you telling me I can't say it? The answer is no. You can say exactly what is making you angry. But we encourage you not to use contempt towards the other person, because contempt will make an enemy for your position.
Yeah. Arthur Brooks, the head of the American Enterprise Institute, has this wonderful book called Love Your Enemies. And
Yeah.
He makes the same point you're making, that you just made. It not only is the way we treat each other a moral proposition, it's also a practical one. He says, the more we have contempt for others, the more others there will be, or something to that effect. So
Yeah.
if you don't want people being that way, that is contrary to the way you think, uh, the last thing you want to do is hold them in contempt, because it will just cause them to dig their heels in more deeply and find more people that think like them.
I mean, if we've ever had a lesson in that, it's our politics now. If you talk to progressives who, let's be honest, for 8 years have been attacking President-elect, as we're talking, Donald Trump. And their attacks have often been filled with contempt. And I would suggest they've changed almost nobody's mind.
Or maybe in the wrong direction if they did change it.
Yeah, exactly. Contempt makes an enemy for your cause.
Yeah.
So if your goal is to disrupt, let's just say you're a progressive and you don't like Donald Trump's policy on, I don't know, pick it, immigration. If your goal is to win people over to your view of what the immigration policy of the United States ought to be, treating Donald Trump and his supporters with contempt is going to backfire. It's going to make an enemy for your point of view.
Yeah.
And vice versa, by the way. The same thing is true of supporters of President-elect Trump. So we're not partisan on this, and we're not here to judge who's the best politician, who's the worst politician. That's not the point. The point is to invite us all to try to change the culture of contempt. And, some people say, well, don't you have to admit that this particular person is the worst offender? I said, well, there are offenders that use contempt more than others. There's no doubt about that. But there is not really, at the national level, a dignity choice. And I asked people to just ask themselves this question. In the last election, was either party known for treating the other party with dignity? Were the Democrats, when they spoke of MAGA Republicans, did they speak of them with dignity? The Republicans, when they spoke of liberals, did they speak of them with dignity? I mean, I would just say, we have data on this, but it's a gut check question here. Almost nobody would answer those questions. Yes.
But people might say, Tim, there are some acts and some people who just are not dignified themselves. Their acts are so awful. How can you hold this belief that a person who commits heinous acts or has really awful political views that are going to hurt people, how can you still feel a sense of dignity towards that person or those actions?
It's a very fair question. And I wouldn't say, first of all, that you necessarily have to feel it. It's hard to feel dignity when you see someone who's done something horrific. But most people, for instance, if I said, do you think people in prison should be treated with dignity? Most people would say, yeah. How about people on death row? Do you think they should be treated with dignity? They've done, in most cases, quite horrible things. Most people would say, well, yeah, they shouldn't be let go. They shouldn't be given privileges, maybe. But they should be treated with dignity until their last breath. So we have within us, Ken, I would say, the awareness that no matter how bad a person's actions may have been, there is something about that person that their dignity isn't gone. no matter what. We may not feel it, but we can look for a way to treat the person, not the point of view. I wouldn't stand here, people say, well, what about Hitler? I wouldn't treat Hitler's point of view with dignity. I wouldn't treat his army with dignity. I wouldn't treat his plans for the dissolution or the destruction of the Jewish people or people. No, those are scandalously horrific ideas. But what the United States did at the end of World War II was we treated, I would say, Germans we treated the country with some degree of dignity, even despite their crimes. Mm. And as a result, we have whatever it is now, an 80-year relationship with a robust, strong, open, free, democratic, economically viable country that was rebuilt because we saw their dignity. Same thing with Japan. Whereas after World War I, for example, and the German loss in that war, the country experienced a decade of humiliation at the hands of the victors, which in some ways led to the ascendancy of the most destructive and contempt-based government, arguably, in the 20th century. So, there's plenty of room for discussion here, and I'm not the Wizard of Oz. Well, maybe I am the Wizard of Oz, hiding behind a curtain, but I don't have all the answers. But I think these are really important conversations.
Yeah.
And I think having these conversations with young people, when does safety trump dignity and you have to get yourself out of an unsafe situation, set a boundary? Good question. You can set a boundary with someone who's hurting you or who's abusing you or who's risking hurting you without wishing them evil. Almost everybody who's broken up a relationship with someone they love has said, hey, look, I used to love you. I don't love you. This isn't working for me anymore. It's not a healthy relationship. I'm setting a boundary. I'm not continuing this relationship. Almost all of us have done that. But we don't have to wish evil on the person at the other side of that boundary. And I would argue that the less evil we visit or try to visit on those with whom we disagree, the more likely we are to get to a place of safety for all of us.
And of course, what we're talking about is having these conversations with kids in schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And having these conversations so kids develop a sense of agency, so they know, hey, if I want to protest something, if I want to be a citizen who believes this or that or the other thing, if I want to get a job in my future and have these qualities, or I go to work someplace and I disagree with someone at work, how do I express myself? Where do I draw lines? How do I learn how to draw lines? How do I learn how to listen? How do I learn how to adopt curiosity when things may not be going my way? How do I learn how to admit that I could be wrong?
I think part of the conversation is convincing, well, first the adults in the school and maybe parents, that this is worth doing in the first place, and why and how you deal with this dilemma. How can I feel or have a sense of dignity towards others whose views I really don't like? And I think what you're describing is an answer to that question. And that there are practical reasons or moral reasons and good reasons to consider a different way. And then to begin having those conversations with kids who are going to object, to say, why, when that person continues to hurt me, why should I feel that they have dignity? And that there's a conversation to be had about it. I just wanted to throw one more little story. You may be familiar with this guy, Daryl Davis, but I'm going to be interviewing him, I think, right after in just a few weeks. But here's a guy, a black man who's a very accomplished musician, played with some of the great musicians, Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis. He's playing music in a club in South Carolina, and this white guy comes up and starts a conversation, and they get to know each other a little bit. And it turns out the white guy is a member of the Klan, and Daryl does not reel away from that. It's hard to imagine him having the conversation, but he does, and he ends up getting this person to question their commitment to this hateful ideology, and eventually quits the Klan and gives him his robes. And then over the period of many years, Davis continues to interact with all kinds of Klansmen, including the Grand Wizard, who over 200 of them end up renouncing this ideology and handing their robes over through listening, through being curious, and maybe the most important thing at the center of it all is having a sense of dignity towards these people who have heinous views and commit heinous acts.
I mean, he's a perfect example of the practical and effective way in which dignity actually does disrupt the culture of contempt.
Hmm.
And I think most of us think, certainly when I was growing up, when I was teaching in New Haven, there was a small but terrifying Klan presence in a neighboring town. And, my view was outrage, and protest and scream and yell and carry placards and stop them and don't allow them to. I don't know that I changed any of their minds about anything. Daryl listens, looks, I almost would say, and I think he uses this language, tries to love. Most of these are men. As he discovers men who've been beaten up themselves emotionally, physically. And, he listens enough to them where they go, oh my God, this is a terrible, terrible mistake I'm making by belonging to a hateful cult. So, this sense in which our intuitive reaction to things that offend us is to be offended and to be angry and to be violent almost in response, emotionally or physically violent. The message here is we just rethink that, because most of the time it doesn't work. Even, I got to tell you, I went up and presented on this stuff at West Point, and I thought to myself, wow, here's the America's finest young men and women who are training to be warriors. And they're going to think to themselves, what the hell is this idiot Tim Shriver coming here telling us about? Don't use contempt, or don't end up in the one where you're killing people. That's their life. They got it immediately, Ken. They were like, this is critical because we are trained to use violence in this most strategic way possible, affecting the smallest number of people possible for the shortest period of time possible with the least destruction possible. Everything we do is to try to minimize the use of contempt and violence so that we can stop it in the future. So they weren't all of a sudden saying, hey, how dare you? They were saying quite the opposite. It's very, and they would argue, and I think most people would argue, there are moments when a 1 or a 2 strategy is necessary. But if it becomes a blanket strategy, it almost certainly will backfire. If it becomes a targeted, if there's one person, if there's somebody who's threatening your life, knocking at your door, carrying a gun, threatening to kill you, you may have to very well use one force to stop him. But if you start shooting everybody on the street and go to his home and kill his family, and then kill everybody he's known and his teachers and his cousins and his neighbors, then you're creating a culture in which violence is met with greater and greater violence. Revenge breeds more need for revenge, and you have a situation like what I would say we almost have now, which is contempt becomes glorified and rewarded, and it makes all of us less happy and less healthy.
Yeah, I've heard people that I know say, "Well, we're fighting the good fight," and I have come to this realization myself that the good fight is only the fight that accomplishes something you care about, and just fighting for fighting's sake, arguing for argument's sake. You can turn to your friends who agree with you and say, "Well, we did that," and there's some pleasure you get, I think, in the camaraderie you get out of fighting the so-called good fight. But if it doesn't really change anything, in fact, if it makes it worse, it's not a good fight.
Oh, it's not only not a good fight, but I just wonder. I mean, I grew up on fighting the good fight, and we're fighting for our candidate, we're fighting for our cause, and we're fighting for our country. And I just wonder whether that's the right metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Can't we work for social justice? Can't we give our souls and spirits and our minds to causes? Can't we enlist each other in building corps of allied friends who are trying to bring about a new reality? Do we have to always be fighting? Do we have to be weaponizing every metaphor? Do we have to be taking down and destroying or breaking? And there's a lot of violence in that language. That you're right. It's kind of maybe makes us feel excited. Oh, let's go for the fight. Come on, everybody organize. But gee, many crickets, I just don't see much evidence that it produces the gains we all say we want.
Yeah, Amanda Ripley in her book High Conflict says is the paradox about high conflict is that within all of us is this impulse to want to fight, to fight the good fight, but also within each of us is a desire to have that go away, to come together. The same people. It's not like some people are fighters and some are peacemakers.
That's right.
Within all of us is that impulse. And I think what you're suggesting, I'd like to shift the conversation back to schools and what educators that are listening can do if they want to pursue this. But I think what we're trying to do is to appeal to that other side, this in our students, that says, you know what, I may have been a bully. I may be inclined to operate at the low levels of the index, but you've suggested a different way of being, and I'm going to think about that. And so share a story or two, if you have one that you can share, of where this has been used by a teacher or maybe school-wide, where they've used the index, how they've used the index, and what difference it's made. And then so that people listening that are educators can come away and say, I want to do that as well. I want to do that at my school.
Well, there's a couple of things. So thanks for asking. First of all, let's go from the top down. In Oklahoma, the governor of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt, has committed himself to using 5 and up language. And his communication team checks actually with our team when they're issuing statements, says, is this a 5 or higher? Because the governor says we have to be 5 or higher. When there was a racial incident in an Oklahoma school, a group of students who used very hateful race-based language and hatred, the governor's statement was, I am committing myself to using dignity, and I'm challenging this school to have all of its students join me. And I want those students who, I'm now extending his language, I want those students who are guilty of this problem to realize that we don't condone it, we won't accept it, and we demand dignity language. That's a governor speaking to kids. To me, that's very powerful. We have superintendents. I mentioned in Salt Lake City, where they've adopted a 5 and up strategy for the school district. They want the code of conduct in the schools for teachers and for students to be 5 and up. We have one teacher I mentioned earlier who's teaching social studies using the Dignity Index as a teaching tool in social studies. How do I use this to help kids get excited? Like, you could do this with characters. You could use the Dignity Index to analyze Hamlet or Macbeth or To Kill a Mockingbird or other pieces of literature, even in 2nd or 3rd grade literature, short stories. So we've seen people using it to bring a kind of a vigor and a lens of excitement to kids as they're studying existing academic content. And then, as I was talking to the superintendent in Hamden yesterday, he wants to actually start teaching the index as a skill. So like just a didactic focus on how to recognize dignity and contempt in yourself and others, and how to grow when you find yourself in a position of contempt. So we're going to work with with the faculty there, I hope, that he's going to select to actually write lesson plan units for probably like a K-3 unit and a 4-8 unit and a high school unit where teachers can adapt it and put it in their classroom. So it really covers the range from codes of conduct to discipline strategies to didactic instruction to infused academic instruction. There's lots of, but we're in early stages. So if someone's listening to this going, wow, I'd love to be involved in that, get in touch with us. We're building kind of teams of practice. We're not going to go back into some lab somewhere and do all this for schools. We're going to work with schools to actually do it in ways that teachers want and need and feel will help them achieve their goals. So we're looking for staff development volunteers, curriculum writers, administrators, teachers, parents, pupil personnel folks who want to be involved in this and can help us figure out how to make it useful and powerful.
Tim, I myself might want to be involved, and I know some people
Good.
that have done things like this. But the reason I say that is that the last episode we published on this podcast was about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, why it's gone off the rail, why it's been pulled from mission statements. But the people I spoke to who are advocates of it really weighed in on what they thought caused it to go off the rail. And I think there's some lessons for promoting dignity in schools and the dignity index. One of the things they said was that it, in many cases, has been done as a top-down thing, is that the trainer, the teacher, the person that comes in is telling the participants how they're supposed to talk and what they're supposed to believe. It is overly didactic. But what they have been doing, at least one person, Shauna Pitt, a woman who is an assistant superintendent at the Sacramento County Office of Education, is that they meet with their peers and they read biographies, they read stories about people, and they share their own stories. And so they sit at the same level. It's a sharing, it's a dialogue, and no one other than a facilitator, no one's really telling people how to believe, or that if you're a member of this group, you should feel shame, or you understand that you and your group are oppressors. But it's really about something more authentic and human and personal that seems to be drawing people in and feeling that. And I would think with these conversations about dignity and training kids that it may be more helpful. I'm just thinking to have conversations and drawing kids to share their experiences rather than a curriculum that is about telling people why this is important and what they need to do to be that kind of person, which sometimes causes kids and adults to resist it if someone's telling them how they're supposed to be.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good point, Ken. I mean, one of my colleagues helped develop this, a woman named Misha Robinson. She's done a lot of work as a DEI trainer, not so much for schools, but for companies and organizations. And she told me that when she started introducing the index as part of her DEI program, it allowed people to talk about their relationships instead of talking about their class or their identities. And identities are important. The history of our country is what it is, and we ought to be truthful about it. Look, let's be honest. There's no. Sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes the truth heals. But either way, it's the truth. That's what we did. And anybody who's lived as long as I have knows that even a one person's story is complicated. And the things for which I'm ashamed. And the things of which I'm proud. I wish I could get rid of the things in my past that I'm ashamed of, but I can't. So we have to tell the truth to each other. But we have to tell the truth in a way that like the only way I can burden myself of my own shame is if I feel like it's safe, I can share it with you, Ken. I can trust you with my weaknesses, with my vulnerabilities, with my mistakes, because I know you want what's good for me and I want what's good for you. And as a country, I think we've sometimes approached the DEI question in recent years as trying to figure out who to blame for things. And if we can just find the right person to blame, then we can be freed of the burden of the pain that the blame or the system has caused us. I think it's a two-step process. first, we've got to strengthen relationships. It's what Jim Comer taught me 50 years ago as a young teacher, or not quite 50, 45, I guess. Strengthen relationships, and then you can teach anything. Mm. Without a relationship, you can't teach anything. And in our country, I think we've approached this issue of how do we create a more equitable future, a more just, more inclusive future. More recently, we've approached that as first thing we have to do is find out and admit to all the mistakes that I've made or you've made or somebody's made. That's a hard thing for people to do if they feel threatened and under attack. I think that's kind of what you're saying. Mm-hmm. I don't want to oversimplify complex cultural, social, systemic issues around race and gender and sexual orientation and all these ways in which our country has sorted people and often oppressed people. These are really complicated and painful challenges to face as a country, and we've got to figure out how to do it better. We can't let go. It's not like DEI or our history is going to go away if we just elect a new president or change our policy. All these things are going to stick around. But I think dignity can be a very powerful tool for making it safe to have these conversations, and hopefully to have conversations in a way that the wounds caused by the past become opportunities to heal us for the future, as opposed to reduce us further and further into camps of oppositional and angry and hostile energy.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for being part of this Courageous Conversations podcast and for all the great you're doing to unite people during these polarized times. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share?
I guess the one thing I'd like to say is that, and I've said this many times, I started my career as a teacher. When I look to the institutions of this nation and I look to who and where are there people who know that everybody deserves a chance, where are the people who know that hope and development are the actual work of community building, of nation building, where are the people who trust that new ideas can emerge? It's schools. There's very few third grade teachers who say, I'm not going to teach those kids. There's very few first grade teachers who say, don't let any of those children in my classroom. We don't, as teachers, teach Republicans versus Democrats. We don't teach rich versus poor. We don't teach black versus white. We teach everyone. It's this fantastically development and future and inclusive oriented profession. And it is the profession and the people doing it that get far, far too little credit, who work so, so hard, but in my view, who have the gifts necessary for changing our culture. And I'm just really honored to have at one point counted myself amongst the teachers of our country, and now count myself as not just someone who admires them, but who hopes to help them do their job better.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Tim. If people are interested in learning more about the Dignity Index, I'll post something on our website.
Yeah, it's dignityindex.us, not .org or .com, but .us. We love the .us URLs. So we're dignityindex.us. Check us out. Write us there. We're a very small team, so even if it just says admin at dignityindex.us, we get it. And we're like I say, we're building a collective or collaborative of shared interest educators who want to work on this, and we'd welcome folks who are listening, including you, Ken, to join us and work with us to try to see if we can make this helpful to our kids and to our communities.
Thanks so much, Tim. Well, for those listening to this conversation, you can find it and all of our episodes at schoolconversations.org and on your favorite podcasting platforms. So long, everyone.